Welcome. This is a mill deck tech based on the cards that I reviewed previously in my mill card review video. If you haven't seen that video, you may want to go there first and check out the different cards and what I say about those cards, but it's not really required either. Now, what I'm going to do is go through the cards in my deck and talk about why I chose those ones. And you'll notice my sideboard's pretty big, but it's actually not normally my sideboard. I just put a few cards in there just to show the different options or some of the better options I've seen. Okay, so we start off with let's start off with our land base. Now, you can see, actually, we'll just jump over to creatures here first. I've got 4 Hedron Crabs. Now, the 4 Hedron Crabs require you to have lands, of course, in order to play them. And it's better if you have fetch lands. So let's go over to the lands quickly. And you'll see that basically what I'm doing is I'm running some Watery Graves. Now, Watery Graves can come in tapped or untapped if you pay 2 life. It's up to you. Sometimes you don't need to, and sometimes you do. It just depends. If I have a chance to tap it on turn 1 and pay 2 life to get a blue mana to cast a Hedron Crab, then I usually will. But it just depends what I'm playing against. If I know I'm playing against Burn or something like that, then I might not tap it just to save myself those 2 life. Now, there's a couple other cards here. So you can see I have Evolving Wilds, and that's kind of just a budget decision, and same thing with Terramorphic Expanse. Those are just more of a budget card to put in there. Ideally, I would put a Polluted Delta or a Flooded Strand in there, but the cost is, pretty significant. A Terramorphic Expanse, I think, is like probably a couple cents, whereas a Polluted Delta is like $7 or $8 online, and it's probably way more on paper. Well, not probably, certainly very much more on paper. I also run 3 Shelldock Isles. Now, Shelldock Isle is pretty nice in that it has Hideaway. Now, one of the cool things, or the key things to look at when you're choosing which card to hide away, is that you can only play this card when your opponent's library, or when a library, probably your opponent's, has 20 cards or fewer in it, so very close to the end of the game. So I've seen some people play this card, and they'll drop like a Hedron Crab underneath it or something like that. Probably when your opponent has 20 cards at the end, they're probably not going to want a Hedron Crab, right? Or you're probably not going to want a Hedron Crab. Probably you're going to want something to kind of finish out the game quicker. So if I have a chance to, I'll throw an Ensnaring Bridge under there, or an Archive Trap, Mind Funeral, something big like that. Cards that you want to drop early are like Mesmeric Orb, Hedron Crab, Manic Scribe, a Thing in the Ice. Like a Thing in the Ice towards the end is not going to do very much for you, unless you just need like a last minute blocker. So given the choice, if you do have the choice, I would put in something like Mind Funeral, Crypt Incursion, or Archive Trap, or Ensnaring Bridge, something like that that could really close out the game fast for you if you can get there. Right? Another thing you could do is, if your opponent's playing some big creatures, is you could also put Breaking and Entering under there, and then you could cast the Entering side of Breaking and Entering. Usually you don't have to do that. I've never really encountered any time when I've had to do that, or had even an opportunity to do that. So it's up to you, but those are the choices I would make. Back to creatures, we have... Oh, sorry. Before I move on to creatures, we have one thing to consider when you're fixing your mana base, and I kind of made this mistake foolishly when I first set it up, is to make sure that you actually match up enough fetch lands with your actual lands. So for instance, if you have, let's say, like 8 fetch lands, but only like 4 lands that they can fetch, that's not really going to help you very much. So just make sure that you actually can fetch the things that you're cracking for. Another thing, as I've almost forgot to mention, is Ghost Quarter. Now, Ghost Quarter is here to disrupt some hands, but not really. It's mainly to trick our opponent into searching their library for a card. So what you do is you destroy their non-basic land with a Ghost Quarter. They search their library to replace it with a basic land, and then you can Archive Trap them. So it's kind of a neat little trick that you can do, and it's won me a few games just by doing that. So on top of after the lands, we have 4 Jace's Phantasms. Jace's Phantasm is just a great card, especially if you can cast them on turn 1. Turn 1, Jace's Phantasm. Turn 2, Glimpse The Unthinkable, puts 10 cards in the library. You've got a 5/5 flyer on turn 2, and your opponent has to do something about that. A very cool thing I like to do, and I have done in the past, is drop a Jace's Phantasm turn 1, a Jace's Phantasm Hedron Crab on turn 2, turn 3 play something like a Mind Funeral or Glimpse The Unthinkable, and you've got basically a mill engine with two 5/5 flyers in the air by turn 3, which is really, really devastating to your opponent. I like Thought Scour, mainly because Thought Scour gives you some draw. For some reason, like occasionally you get you just run out of gas, and Thought Scour is a nice way just to mill 2 cards, but to get you a few extra cards. So as a 2-of, it's definitely worth it. Now, it's one thing I want to show you is also, if we take a look here, is our hypergeometric calculator here. So you want to look at the chance of actually drawing a card. So if your population size is 60, the number of successes, so let's say I really want to get a Hedron Crab in my opening hand. There's 4 of them. Okay, the sample size is 7, so I'm drawing 7, and the number of successes would be just 1. Okay, so we can click calculate, and you can see that the odds of me getting 1 or more is 0.39. So cumulative property of 1 or more is 40% of the time. So that means that I'm given this distribution. If I have a 4 of Hedron Crab in my deck, I'm only going to start with them in maybe 1 or more 40% of the time. Okay, and greater than 1 is actually only 6%. So it's very unlikely you're going to start with 2, but in about a third of the games you're going to start with 1 of them. Okay, and in maybe 6% you're going to get 2 of them. So not too bad. Now if you look at lands, because there's only running 20 lands. Okay, so we've got 20 lands. I like to start with 2. So sample size would be 7, and successes, I like to start with at least 2 lands. Okay, so we calculate. Okay, 75% of the time you're going to have 2 or more lands in your hand. Now that's actually not really that great. Okay, now the reason why is because it means 25% of the time, if you look X is less than 2, that you're going to have 24% of the time, or 25, or every 1 out of 4 games, you're only going to have like 1 or 0 lands in your hand, which means that you're going to get kind of mana screwed sometimes. So you might have to mulligan aggressively. And it's one thing I've thought about is upping the lands. So for instance, if I was to put 22 lands, so take 2 things out, recalculate, you can see now my probability goes up to 81% of the time I'll get more than 2 lands. Now, I haven't really found that to be too much of a problem because Thought Scour will often help me to get those lands if I can. Same thing with Visions of Beyond. It kind of sucks to have to cast it early on, but if you're mana screwed and you don't really want to mulligan too far down, then you can cast one of these and often pick up a land. Okay, next is Visions of Beyond. Visions of Beyond is actually a really great card. Mainly because it gives you a card draw for 1 mana, but also it's very easy to get 20 cards in your opponent's graveyard. So in that way, once there's 20 cards in there, you're drawing 3 cards for 1 mana, which is just, that's just gold. Right, Manic Scribe I like, but it's hard to get Manic Scribe to go off, to get Delirium with Manic Scribe, unless you have Mesmeric Orb out. Okay, so if you look at the types, the card types, okay, we've got instants, sorceries, lands. Lands are easy because you have so many fetches. Creatures, okay, so you got, and a few artifacts. It's possible to get them in, but sometimes difficult. It's way better if you have Mesmeric Orbs. So there's synergy between these 2 cards, which is great, but I think it's only a 2-of. Now, instead of having 4 Manic Scribes, what I did is I put 4 or 2 more Things in the Ice. Thing in the Ice is rarely ever something you're sad to see. A Thing in the Ice basically is a good blocker up front, and then every time you cast one of your mill spells, you're essentially just opening it up to create the Awoken Horror. Right? And that's going to basically give you a board wipe and then a 7/8 creature. Now, the cool thing about that is that by the time Thing in the Ice goes off, that's usually the time when you need to have the board wiping in effect. And even if you get them late game, having a 0/4 blocker is not too bad. People really don't like Thing in the Ice. They almost feel like they have to remove it right away. And so it's going to draw their attention away from what you're doing. And just a great card. Glimpse The Unthinkable, of course, is the best card that you can get in for milling. By far, 2 mana for 1 blue, 1 black for 10 cards. It's just unbelievable. So that's pretty much a must-play 4 of. Now, it's also very expensive, so if you don't have the money to purchase Glimpse The Unthinkable, you can just switch it with Breaking, and then there's also, I think it's Tome Scour, which can do 7 for 2, which is not too bad. It's not as good, of course, but still, it'll make the deck way more affordable. Mesmeric Orb is another great card. I think it's a must-have 4 of. So whenever a permanent becomes untapped, that permanent's controller puts the top cards of his or her library into the graveyard. Like I said, it really helps with your Manic Scribe. It can also enable your Shelldock Isle, because Shelldock Isle doesn't say your opponent's library has to have 20 or fewer, it just says any library. Right, so even when you're milling yourself, you could enable your Shelldock Isle faster. That's actually never happened where I've had less than 20 and my opponent hasn't. Because you're milling your opponent so aggressively, it's way more likely that they're going to get below 20 before you do. So Mesmeric Orb is pretty good. Well, not pretty good. It's great. I would not take it out, especially if you can get 2 of them or 3 of them on the board at a time. What I usually do is I hold off on casting it until my opponent has tapped a lot of lands or tapped a lot of things. So if he's got like 4 or 5 things tapped, then I'll drop one or 2 Mesmeric Orbs if I have them in hand on my turn, and then let him untap and mill first. Okay, and then of course I'm going to have to mill myself as well, but like I said, it's a race and you're going to mill him faster than he's going to mill you. Crypt Incursion is a really good card. I wouldn't take it as a 4 of, because once you cast it, you're going to exile all the creature cards from the person's library, and you're just basically not going to be able to cast it again for any real value. So Crypt Incursion is only a 2 of, but it can really help to keep you alive. Mind Funeral is kind of a toss-up. I'm not sure how I really feel about this. So with Mind Funeral, if we go back to our hypergeometric distribution, okay, so your opponent's starting with 53 cards, assuming they didn't mulligan. So number of successes in population, let's say they're playing 24 lands, or let's say 22. Okay, usually decks run between 20 and 24 lands, although some run much fewer. Sample size is 7, they're drawing 7 cards. And let's see, okay, well, actually, sorry, that's not right. So what I want to look at is how many times I'm going to get 4 lands. Okay, so let's say, I want to say, how often is Mind Funeral going to get me 8 lands? Okay, or 8 cards milled. Okay, so this is mill 8 and 4 of those are lands. Okay, if there's 53 cards in the library and 22 lands in the whole thing. Okay, so I calculate, okay, x equals 4, 25% of the time. Okay, so 25% of the time, I'm going to get 8 lands, or 8 cards from that. Right, now if I go to 9, okay, calculate. Okay, so if they draw 9, 56% of the time there's going to be 4 cards by the time you get to 9. Right, so really what you'll find, what I've done is kind of toyed around with this. So I played 7, okay, 30%. So most likely only 30% of the time you're going to have 4 or more if they mill 7. 8 is 43. Okay, so you have 4 or more. If you mill 9, 56. So you're looking at between 8 and 9 cards in general that you're going to mill with Mind Funeral. Now, that just depends. Like, you could get really lucky, but you could also get really unlucky. So I'm kind of iffy about this card. Like a Tome Scour, or I'm not sure if it's Tome Scour or Thought Scour. One of those might be, no, sorry, it would be Tome Scour. Mill 7 or mill 5 for 1 or whatever. One of those other cards would maybe a better replacement because they're cheaper and they have almost the same effect. It just depends how your opponent's playing. If they have a ton of fetch lands and stuff, they're not going to have a lot of lands, and your Mind Funeral will do great work for you. Archive Trap is a really, really wonderful card. It doesn't seem like it, but especially when you can combine it with Ghost Quarter, you can really get it off. And usually towards the end, you're going to have 5 or 6 mana, and you'll be able to just hard cast it out and mill for 13. Breaking is basically, as I've said before, is the baby brother of Glimpse The Unthinkable. It's 2 mana, mill 8. That's just another super value card, and it's just tremendous. I've never actually had the chance to cast cast the entering side from from a Shelldock Isle, but it would be interesting if you did. I guess there could be some things where you could do this, but it would be very difficult to usually by that time you're just going to either win the game or not. So I can see a situation where it might work, but overall you're probably just going to cast entering most of the time. Okay, so looking at the sideboard really just is heavily dependent on your meta. These are some of the common cards that I've tried. Now, in the past, I've had Consuming Aberration, but I found Consuming Aberration just is way too slow, and I never got to play it. Or if I could get onto the board, the opponent just really chump blocked it, and the game got closed out pretty quick. So here are some cards that I've really like. Hurkyl's Recall, depending if people are playing a lot of artifacts in your meta, it's kind of a toss-up. It just depends. Usually if someone's playing Affinity, you're probably dead anyways, but if they're playing Thopters or something like that, it might give you a bit of an extra chance. Another one is Grafdigger's Cage here that might really help. Now you have a ton of graveyard hate, so Grafdigger's Cage might be a little unnecessary, but again, it's a decent card, especially as a 1-of. Extirpate and Surgical Extraction are really great. I like those cards a lot. Although I generally don't get to cast them too often, but when you need them, you really need them. A great example is if your opponent has like Emrakul in their library. Now, if your opponent's got an Emrakul, he's probably only got one of them, and basically what you want to do is try and mill to Emrakul, hope he's at the top somewhere. Right? That's already a bad matchup, but you hope he's at the top somewhere. As soon as it goes through the graveyard, all the other graveyard cards are going to go back to the library. But before Emrakul resolves, he's still sitting in the graveyard, and then you can surgically extract him or extirpate him. You can also Crypt Incursion him as well. So that's a common thing that people may forget, is that when Emrakul goes to the graveyard, before he gets shuffled back in, you can actually run Crypt Incursion and just cancel and basically exile him and get 3 life from him. So, or her. I guess Emrakul's a girl. Okay, other cards are Spellskite. Spellskite's really great against burn. Okay, it'll keep you alive, give you a little blocker. It's also really great if you're playing against Bogles. Bogles comes out really fast, but if you can drop a Spellskite, you pretty much won the game. Pithing Needles can be really good to turn off Planeswalkers. Usually, I haven't found Pithing Needle to be too effective, but well, they're effective, but not really in the meta that I play in. Okay, Darkness I found is awesome. Okay, no one expects a 1-mana Black Fog. I don't know why, but people just generally don't play this card too often. But Darkness, where you can prevent all combat damage that we dealt this turn. Especially I played with a red Exalted deck, or against a red Exalted deck, and they pumped their creature, and basically wasted all of the lands in all their pump spells, and then it just cast Darkness and prevent all damage, and at the end of turn the creature just goes back to being a 1/1. I think it was a Monastery Swift Spear or something like that. And then your opponent's left with no pump spells with their Exalted, or not Exalted, with their Prowess deck. Hero's Downfall and Murderous Cut, both really good. I don't really like Murderous Cut to have too many of them, because it depends on you having a lot of cards to delve in your graveyard. I have used this from time to time, along with Hero's Downfall, but Hero's Downfall is pretty good, especially because it can also get a Planeswalker as well. Ravenous Trap, great card, okay, because if you have like a Hedron Crab on the battlefield, you play a land, there's 3 cards that went to the graveyard. Then here it says if an opponent had 3 or more cards put into the graveyard from anywhere, you can pay 0, so you can just empty their graveyard right away. Right, so Ravenous Trap is a really nice one, and it's very easy to enable the 0 cost on that. Profane Memento is very effective. I'm toying with putting 3 of them in. When you really need them, then they're really good. Especially like if you can get 2 or 3 of them out. When I've had 2 of them out at a time against like a very creature heavy deck, and I think I ended with almost 60 life. It was ridiculous, like how much life I was gaining off of all the creatures. Okay, so Ensnaring Bridge, again, if they have some big fatties coming out, Ensnaring Bridge is very easy to get out, right? Especially if you hide it underneath Shelldock Isle. That's about the time you're going to need it. Okay, but even still, you're casting things so fast, you're just going so aggressively that it's very difficult for your opponent, or it's going to be very difficult for you to keep actually a lot of cards in your hand, unless you just get totally mana screwed. So overall, it's very easy to have an empty hand with the Ensnaring Bridge. Now, that's what I like in my deck, and this is what I run. But if you have any other ideas, feel free to put them into the comments. I'd certainly be open to different ideas, and I'm always looking to improve as well. So I look forward to hearing from you and seeing what you guys think. Remember, if you do like these videos, to like and subscribe. That really helps, and let me know what you want to see. Thanks a lot, and see you next time.